Hello everyone, Salam, Namaste, Adab, and welcome to today's event. Today we are going to visit 1857, the revolt of 1857 in Delhi, new insights from Urdu poetry, newspapers, and memoirs. And the speaker for today's event is Dr. Swapna Liddle, who is a historian, author, art curator, and heritage conservator in Delhi. She will be formally introduced by Rana Safvi, herself a very well-known historian, author, and podcaster. She also blogs on ranasafi.com. She is a very well-known author also. The speakers are very well known in the history of Delhi and the Mughal period. And the concluding remarks will be given by Dr. Rakesh Bhatbayal, who is an associate professor at the Center for Media Studies, the School of Sciences, Social Sciences, JNU, New Delhi. And so, welcome you all, and let's start with Rana Safi for the formal introductory remarks. Thank you. Rana.
Thank you so much. And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Swapna Liddle to the Indian diaspora of Washington, D.C., which has been actually doing a very stellar service for the past many years. And you have collected a huge archive of lectures on very different topics from poetry to history to literature, etc., even dramatics and other topics, news also. Dr. Swapna Liddle is a very distinguished Indian historian, author, heritage conservator, specializing in Delhi's architectural and cultural history. She has dedicated her professional life to exploring and preserving the rich historical narrative of Delhi. She has a very impressive academic background. She did her BA from St. Stephen's College and MA and MPhil from Center of Historical Studies, JNU, and PhD from Jamia Millia Islamia. As a heritage conservation expert, she was previously the convener of the Delhi chapter of INTAC, and that's how I first came in touch with Swapna in 2014 or 15, I think. Her work focuses on raising awareness about Delhi's architectural and cultural heritage. Her books have been very widely acclaimed and very well received and popular. These include the Delhi 14 historic walks, uh, Chandni Chowk, the Mughal city of Delhi, Connaught Place, and the making of New Delhi, Shah Jahanabad, mapping a city, the Gardens of Delhi, which she has co-authored with her sister, and a very well acclaimed The Broken Script, which is what the focus, which actually has a quite a big chapter on the topic today. She is very, as I said, passionate about heritage preservation and believes that people should take pride in protecting historical sites, viewing them as potential contributors to cultural tourism. She specializes in 19th century Delhi, particularly exploring the intellectual and cultural developments during the transition from Mughal to British rule. She emphasizes understanding historical context beyond simplistic narratives, highlighting Delhi's complex multicultural identity. And apart from all these academic and other professional pursuits, she is also one of the few people who are, that's who are very active on social media, and she conducts history walks. She uses the social media to share historical insight. And Swapna, I haven't seen your post for a long time. You used to put up those Saturday weekend posts with a very long explanation, and I've learned a lot from that in the past. And engages the public in understanding Delhi's rich historical tapestry, making history more approachable and interactive. And today's topic, which is the revolt of 1857 in Delhi, new insights from Urdu poetry, newspapers, and memoirs, is actually a very important topic, and something which has not been, touched upon and talked about enough, as in my opinion. We always, and so, a lot has been written on 1857, but much of it has also been from the colonial lens. So it's a pleasure to hear somebody speaking from an Indian point of view, from coming from a very informed position of having studied these newspapers, the periodicals, the memoirs, And I look forward to your talk, Swapna. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Rana. I'm extremely grateful to the um, Indian diaspora of Washington, D.C. Metro for having given me this opportunity to give a talk. And I know the list of very, very illustrious speakers that you've had in the past, so I feel especially honored. I'm very grateful again to Ms. Rana Safi, who's given me such so many kind words about me. We have had this relationship for a long time now, having been working in the same sphere. So it's always a pleasure to meet up with her. And I'm also very grateful to Dr. Rakesh Bhattabayal, who incidentally was my classmate in JNU and has very kindly agreed also to present some concluding remarks for today. So to begin with this talk, and it's on 1857 in Delhi, but I do intend to focus specifically on the kind of insights that we get from the sources that have been written in Urdu. And specifically, these are memoirs, there are newspapers, and there's poetry. And when we read these, we get insights that are quite different actually from the much better known and more talked about English sources. And the sad thing is that certainly in India, many of these Urdu sources are not so much read. So therefore, people don't know about them. So I intend to talk a little bit about that. I would like just to start, make a few introductory, sort of just place a context for those who may not be very familiar with 1857 as it unfolded in Delhi, just the broad outlines I will place, and then I will talk more in a more focused manner. So 1857, the revolt of 1857, uprising against British rule, the rule of the East India Company, which engulfed large parts of North and Central India, it broke out on the 10th of May, 1857 in Meerut. And these soldiers and it broke out as a mutiny of soldiers. It started as a mutiny of soldiers, though, of course, later it attained a much, much wider character. But it started as a mutiny of soldiers. And these soldiers, once they mutinied, they immediately set off for Delhi. They set off for Delhi and arrived in Delhi the next morning. The reason they set out for Delhi was because in Delhi at the time, though the East India Company had been ruling in Delhi since 1803, the Mughal emperor still lived in the Red Fort as a sort of initially, he was seen as a sort of puppet of the East India Company. After a while, they even uh, disavowed this role as a puppet for him. So he was staying there as a sort of pensioner. And at the same time, the British had already decided that after his death, the Mughal dynasty would not be recognized as a ruling power at all, in any kind of symbolic sense also. So that was the Mughal emperor. The soldiers who arrived in Delhi told the emperor, "We have come to fight in your name." And though Bahadur Shah II, whose pen named Zafar, we know him as a poet mostly by his Takhallus, which is Zafar, he was reluctant initially to accept that role as the leader of the revolt. But his own family members, his sons, his grandsons, urged him to take on that role, mainly because they felt that without this was their last ditch chance. If British rule could be thrown out, it is possible that the dynasty would survive as a ruling power. So he finally gave in. He accepted the mantle of leader. Delhi became a center of the revolt. Delhi became a center of the revolt, and the British were thrown out of the city. And in time, all sorts of all the soldiers who were uh, who had many soldiers began to mutiny all over the country. As I said, North and Central India mostly. And large numbers of them started coming to Delhi because they wanted to join the movement, especially under the banner of the Mughal emperor. So Delhi becomes this center of the revolt. It becomes the a place from where and there are other centers which develop in time, but at this point, Delhi is the main center of the revolt. So this is there. At the same time, the British slowly regroup, they come back, they lay siege to the city, and for 4 months there, after 4 months, a little after 4 months of the revolt having broken out, they managed to break back into the city and recapture it. So the revolt failed. It failed. Delhi at least fell, though the revolt carried on in other places after that also. But for Delhi, that was the end. So this is the broad, and of course, after the revolt was crushed in Delhi, there was a huge retribution that was exacted against the people of Delhi. There were severe punishments, and I will talk about, those are quite well known. There was a lot of violence. The city was destroyed in many ways. The Mughal royal family are exiled. They are thrown out of the Red Fort. All the royal properties are confiscated. Many of the people who have participated in the revolt, and especially Muslims, were made targets of all the blame for the revolt was thrown on largely on Muslims. So that is how the revolt finally ends. But what I am talking about today is specifically what is the character of this revolt, and especially what we need to see is its political aspects and its social aspects. What are it? And in political, I also mean ideological aspects. And some of this comes out particularly clearly in some newspaper reports and also in the poetry. So, first of all, very simply, what is the political character of this revolt? It is a revolt against British rule, but what does it seek to put in its place? I have said that the soldiers who come to Delhi ask Bahadur Shah Zafar to be their leader. But the government that is put in place after this is a very interesting government because it is not simply a revival of Mughal rule. Yes, the Mughal emperor is the head, but and of course, there are members of the royal family who are given important positions. However, the government is strongly held in the hands also of the soldiers, the rebel soldiers who have come to Delhi, those who had mutinied in Meerut. They are joined by others coming in from time to time, and they are joined by the soldiers who were stationed in Delhi as well. And ultimately, they form a government which is, they call it a court of administration. And that court of administration has within it, it never worked probably very well because these are experimental things. It's for its time, it's very experimental. It's a court of administration which has representatives of the army. It has representatives from the citizenry of the city. So the idea that you have a rule that is going to be representative to some extent of important power centers along with the monarchy, that is something that is being experimented with. So that is definitely there. The soldiers are very, very important in this. Now, this is the overall theoretical structure of the government. As I said, it never worked without problems, mainly because this was a very difficult time for the city. This was a time when there was war put all sorts of pressures because the city was under siege. There was bombardment that was going on from the British position outside the city. The people inside had to organize, and many thousands of soldiers had come from outside. They had to be housed, they had to be fed, money had to be raised in order to sustain the war effort as well. So it is a period of great tensions and great tension in the city. And there is distrust, there is violence as well. And of course, there is, I will talk about the violence a little bit more, but just to give you an idea, when the soldiers first enter, their first aim is to eliminate all their enemies. And the enemies they see as the British. So the British administration is their enemy. That's the people they want to overthrow. So many British officials are killed. Those who don't escape are killed. Many women and children are also um, killed. Many manage to escape. And they are the British, not only British rule, but British physically are thrown out or killed and eliminated from the city. So that is so that obviously does involve a lot of violence. Now, all this is happening. As I said, the administration that is put in place is one which has elements of representation. It's not a simple revival of old authoritarian rule. But as time goes on, we also see the articulation of more clear ideas about what is the regime that, how, first of all, how people, or at least the intellectual elite, how they view British rule and how they view a possible future, what is going to happen. And one of the people whom I think we should really look at is Muhammad Baqir. Muhammad Baqir was a journalist. He was the editor of the Delhi Urdu Akhbar. And he really writes, he becomes an ideologue for the revolt. He is very strongly for the revolt, and his writings are very interesting because he, first of all, articulates quite clearly what is wrong with British rule. And one of the things he talks about, others have also talked about it, which is the racism. The fact that British rule was based on racist principles. And he quite clearly makes the point that the British sort of, shall we say, they denigrate Indians, calling them black men. And and each time he makes these kind of statements about the British, he does compare them to what was under Mughal rule. So one of the things he says is that the Mughal emperors treated all their subjects equally. Nobody was discriminated against on the basis of their religion or on the basis of their ethnic background. So he makes that point. He's contrasting British rule to what had gone earlier in the form of Mughal rule. Another very interesting point that is made by Muhammad Baqir is the idea of economic exploitation. And there have been scholars, particularly my Professor Bipan Chandra, who always reminded us when we were studying nationalism that the early part, the roots of nationalism really begin with the appreciation of economic exploitation. I mean, what he said was it was not a xenophobia. It's not xenophobia against a different race of people. It is appreciation of the economic impact of British rule. And Muhammad Baqir makes that very clear in the newspaper. He says that what is happening today is that these British people, they have gathered the resources of this country. They have all their policies, whether it is reserving higher jobs for people of their own race or their practice of sending things away back home. They are pulling the resources of this country and they are sending them out of the country. So he is formulating what is really later becomes known as the drain of wealth theory, which Dadabhai Nauroji and others have talked about more fully. And there is this realization that why you should oppose this rule is because it is exploitative. It is an early appreciation of how colonialism really works as a system. So that is definitely there. Now, while we are looking at this kind of a critique of British rule, there is also the idea that what is being formed now is a nation. These are very nascent ideas of a nation coming together. So Muhammad Baqir often says, and he will always says, Hindus and Muslims, we must get together. And he talks about Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs. He talks about different ethnicities, different languages. He has this idea that what is coming together is not one ethnicity, or it's beyond being subjects of one particular ruler. It is a nationhood that is being formed in a sense, in opposition to the British. So there is this idea, nascent idea of a religion, of a nation also coming together. There is, in fact, this happens even in the pronouncements of this government that is formed in Delhi. There are all the proclamations that come from the court, from the Mughal emperor and others, are all calling all the people of the territory who live here. And it's always, often, it says Hindus and Muslims. And that's kind of a shorthand for what they're trying to express as Indians. The idea that this is a nation that it has to come together to fight against this exploitation and against this rule. Not simply because these are foreign people who are involved in this, but because they are exploitative, because it is a system which leads to the rule which benefits somebody else, another country. So that is definitely there. Now, while this seems to be a uniting ideology which should bring everybody together, there are other aspects of the revolt which tear the city apart, which ultimately, according to me, lead to the failure of the revolt as well. And when we look at that, it is very complex. I do not agree with some others who have said that it is communal tensions that break apart the revolt. My idea is different. And if you look at some of the memoirs, one of the memoirs which, in fact, Ms. Rana Sakfi has translated, Zahir Dehelvi's memoir of Delhi, and one of the things that he talks about is the violence of the revolt, but specifically the violence that is perpetrated by the incoming soldiers, by certain, what he sees as the criminal classes or the underclasses in the city. And that is something that invariably, when we look at memoirs, all the elite are quite shocked by that. In fact, by the way, incidentally, I must say that a lot of the elite who lived through that part of 1857 were actually quite shocked at the violence even against the British. In fact, Bahadur Shah Zafar himself tries to save the lives of many of the British women and children, particularly, who had taken refuge in the fort. And there are others also, like Hamid Ali Khan, who's one of the nobles of the city, hiding Europeans to try and save them. So that violence is one aspect. The other aspect is, it's something that is not talked about much, which is an upturning of the social order. What happens is that many of the people who are from the city particularly, who rise up and join these soldiers and are at the forefront of this, of the opposition and of the violence and all of that is going on, are people, some of them are from outside the city. They are Gujars and Mewatis who live in the surrounding villages. They come in, and there are criminals who have been released from the jail, but they are also the non-criminal laboring poor. They are they are described in the memoirs. They are, and in the newspaper also, wrestlers, tanners. They are washermen, water carriers, bishti, carriers of night soil. They are butchers. They are greengrocers, weavers. These are the people who particularly, what they do is they see this as an opportunity to enrich themselves as well. What they do is they when the soldiers come, these are soldiers from outside. They tell them, I can point out a European's house. I can point out a European's shop. Or I can even point out an Indian in whose house a European is hiding. Now, some of these, and of course, the idea is to drive out the British. But at the same time, there is also the opportunity to loot. There's an opportunity to loot things from shops, from houses, and this sort of underclass finds this opportunity to do just that. And many of the people who become victims of this are the rich of the city. They're not necessarily British only. So there is one, for instance, one very rich banker, Saligram, whose house is looted. There are many others also. So this sets up a sort of a class divide inside the city over this question of who is to pay for the revolt, all the money that is needed, and the fact that this underclass now enriches itself. Through the looting, it enriches itself, and they see a kind of upward mobility happening. And because what they do is many of them will also put on uniforms. They put on uniforms, they get themselves arms, they get themselves horses, they become soldiers. And that threatens the established army, because the soldiers who had rebelled who were part of the Bengal army that had rebelled, these are all these are elite from elites from social classes which are different, a social class that is different from these particular, because they are, first of all, they are high caste Hindus, for instance. They are Rajputs, they are Brahmins, they are Sayyids, they are Pathans, and they feel that they are upset by this upturning of the social order, where they see lower castes and classes arming themselves, becoming soldiers. So that is one point of tension that happens. Also, at the same time, paradoxically, it is the elite who see these soldiers also as outsiders. So they are unhappy about that also. I will talk about some of the poetry that comes out of that. But so these people who had earlier performed menial tasks in the city, they decide, after they have enriched themselves, they feel a sense of liberation, and they immediately refuse to take up their menial tasks again. So in fact, the Delhi Urdu Akhbar does mention the fact that there are the bhishtis have stopped filling water in the houses, the sweepers have stopped cleaning the streets, they've stopped cleaning the houses. There is a fear of an epidemic breaking out. And we have instances, for instance, the army used to draft people for digging trenches, for carrying gunpowder, making ammunition, etc. And these people, they say, we will not do menial tasks anymore, because they have enriched themselves, and they say, we will not do menial tasks anymore. And it's very interesting what the result of this is. What is the reaction that people have? Because there are people, the elite are, you can understand why the elite would be quite alarmed by this kind of thing. As far as the government is concerned, it's interesting that there is a response which tries to kind of accommodate this kind of feeling that is happening. So one of the things is, of course, that Bahadur Shah Zafar, he gives a a flag and kettle drums, a nishan to these newly recruited soldiers, so that they can actually get some legitimacy as soldiers. The other thing that happens is a very interesting notice is sent out from the deputy Kotwal. You can say he's the deputy commissioner of police in the city. And this deputy Kotwal sends out a letter to all the thanadars, to all the chiefs of heads of the police stations in the city. And he says that so far, every time you address the Mughal emperor, you call him Hazrat Jahanpana Salamat, his exalted majesty. And he says, henceforth, you will address him as Gharib Parvar Salamat. You will, the protector of the poor. So there is a revision in, so the emperor himself is responding to this by saying that I am not just, my claim to rule you, to be your leader, is because I'm the protector of the poor. So there is this response, this kind of reaction and desire to accommodate these kind of sentiments that are now rising. So it is a very, very complex situation that you see developing in this city. It cannot be, ultimately, it cannot be contained because the elite are against, ultimately, many of the elite. And these are service elite, these are intellectual elite, these are mercantile elite, whether they are the merchants, whether they are the nobility, whether they are the intellectual elite, they are basically against the violence and other things of this soldiers' government, a government that is dominated by the soldiers, and against this kind of social upturning of the social order. And this you can see very clearly in the poetry that comes out of 1857. There is this genre of Sheher-e-Ashok poetry, and after 1857, there is quite a lot of this written. And when you see this, these are, of course, poets who are all, again, themselves from an elite and somewhat conservative class in social terms. And when you read their poetry, you realize what the elite outlook on the revolt is. And for instance, I'll give you a few examples, just read out a few verses. So one is Mirza Khan Dagh. Dagh, of course, Dagh Dehlvi is very well known. And Dagh wrote a Sheher-Ashok, of which I'll just give you three lines from that. It says, and this is, he's talking about the soldiers who are coming from outside. And he says, जगह जगह थे जमींदार दार की सूरत, चढ़े ही आते थे सर पर बुखार की सूरत, बला से कम न थी एक एक गंवार की सूरत. What he is saying is that these are peasants who are coming in. They are peasants who are coming in, and they are irrepressible like a fever. And each rustic has the face of evil. So the idea, this is typically a sophisticated urban man's reaction to the soldier of the Bengal army, who is ultimately of a peasant background. He also, another thing that he says, this is a part of another verse. He says, गजब में कोई जो रैयत बला में शहर आया, ये पूर्वी नहीं आए खुदा का कहर आया. That is again a Delhiwala's reaction to the Purabiya of people who are coming, from. So most of the recruits into the Bengal army of the East India Company were from what is present day Uttar Pradesh, Haryana, western parts of Bihar. So these are Purabiyas. To the Delhiwala, they are all uniformly Purabiyas. And it is, so there is a lot of this kind of Delhi chauvinism that you see in this kind of poetry, the Sheher-Ashok poetry. The other category of people, so these are the soldiers that they are talking about. The other category of people are the Delhiwalas, who are according to these people, these elite, they are all the badmashes. They are the laboring poor, they are the criminal classes, and according to them, they are the other problem. So there is this poet called Muhammad Taqi Khan Soza, and he writes, यहाँ के जितने थे औबाश मिल के उनके साथ, the riffraff of the city have joined these soldiers. क्या बताएं तुम्हें जर के हाथ आने की बात. Remember, they are saying that what can I say about the money that has come into their hands? Ultimately, they've looted, right? जो घर कोई तकते तो उस पर चढ़ाते, फिरंगी इसमें है ये कहकर घर वो लुटवाते. So these what he's saying is what I have spoken of earlier. The loot which happens, the targeting of rich people on the pretext of their having hidden Europeans. So that you can see that being talked about in this. Also, this strong feeling that this social order has been upturned. This is a constant refrain. In fact, later when we see memoirs, I'm talking about memoirs and poetry, which is immediately after 1857. But even later, when you see a lot of the memoirs that come up, this idea that there is a strong upturning of the social order. The elite have been reduced to penury. The elite have been reduced to penury, and it's the poor, the unworthy who have come up. That is very much there. And there is this, I think, nothing exemplifies this kind of sentiment more than one particular Shahr-e-Ashub, which is by a poet called Muhammad Zahur, and his takhallus is Zahur. And he says, सदा तनूर झोंके था जो लड़का नान बाई का, भरा है इसके सर में अब तो सौदा मीरजाई का, करोली बांध के निकले है लड़का कसाई का, अमीरों के बराबर बैठे है फर्जंद दाई का. So he says the street cook's lad who did nothing but stoke the fire, now he's fancying himself a Mirza. And the son of the butcher, he goes around wearing a hunting knife. He has also pretensions to nobility here. And the son of the midwife, Daika, Farzand Daika, the son of the midwife now sits on level with noblemen. This idea that there is an upturning of the social order is very, very much evident. So what does this eventually lead to? This leads to a fear among the elite, a fear among the mercantile elite, fear among the literary, landed elite, service elite, and they withdraw their support from by and large. There are exceptions. Muhammad Baqir is definitely an exception. He continues to be in favor of the revolt till the very end on the kind of ideological grounds that I have already talked about. But many, many of them withdraw their support. They do not give, they don't give financial support to the army. And because of that, ultimately the revolt does weaken. The resistance against British bombardment fails, and the revolt fails in Delhi. So there may be many, many other reasons around the country why the revolt fails. I'm not making this claim for the rest of the country, but in Delhi, we certainly see this very interesting development, which I think we have not talked about enough. But it is, I think, well to see these complexities that are there in the revolt of 1857 in Delhi. Of course, what happens ultimately is that the elite who are fearful of this kind of social uprising, of this of the consequences of this revolt, where it is going to lead, what is the kind of future that is going to come, what is the kind of future regime that is going to be put in place once the war has finally been won. They are fearful. Will there be a total upturning of the social order? Will there be the Mughal emperor, will he take charge? Will some other kind of government take charge? They are fearful and they withdraw their support. But what they don't realize is that once the British come back, they lose everything anyway, because the British retribution is so harsh that they do not discriminate between that you are part of the elite and you did not wholeheartedly support the revolt. The axe falls on everyone, and the city in many ways is destroyed, and many of the people are destroyed, and particularly the elite, actually, because they have more to lose. So they are destroyed. All the, there is, again, a lot has been written on it. Ms. Rana Safi herself has translated and many important works which deal with this particular issue in Delhi. And this ultimately leads in the city's destruction, the destruction of much of its elite, the emigration of much of its elite who leave the city, start new lives elsewhere. But that is, of course, not part of my talk right now. But I am going to, Ghalib, I'll end with Ghalib. Ghalib, in September 1860, he writes to a friend of his and he says, he talks about how the city is being broken. He says, यहाँ शहर ढह रहा है, बड़े बड़े नामी बाजार, खास बाजार, उर्दू बाजार, खानम का बाजार, हर एक बजाय खुद एक कस्बा था, अब पता ही नहीं कि कहाँ थे. So he sees the destruction because there is actually physical destruction of the city also. There are large parts which are razed to the ground, and that it's a tragedy. It is a tragedy, the whole unfolding of how the revolt unfolds, how it fails, and the very tragic aftermath of it. But it has within it ideas of emerging nationhood. It has ideas of anti-colonialism. It has ideas of further democratization of the polity. And these are all ideas that you see within the revolt of 1857. Sometimes you see them as very disparate elements within this revolt in the city. But these were all things that presage our shall we say, national movement that was to come in the later decades of the 19th century, and of course, ultimately grow over the 20th century and lead to independence finally, and the kind of nation that we did emerge as a democratic nation. So that is just a few thoughts on 1857 and Delhi. I thank you very much for listening to me. I would be very happy to try and answer any questions that you might have also. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was really very interesting, and obviously, we have some question after in the question answer session. Let us have the concluding remarks by Dr. Rakesh Patel, and after that, we will enter into the question. Rakesh ji, sir, kahan?
Thank you, Razi Saab. This was a master class, and I'm so proud of the kind of historiography that post-independent India has produced, which in its most excellent form was just demonstrated without much fuss by Swapna Liddle. What this lecture contained, people who are not familiar with the historical debate, but at least familiar with, and most of us are familiar with, the Ghadar, or as it was said, first war of independence by some, as some of would remember as Revolt of 1857. So there are many nomenclature. What this lecture by Swapna Liddle brought out to us are the nuances of, first, through sources, what kind of history we get. The second is, what did this revolt contained in itself for the future, that she ended with: democratic India, freedom movement, nation nationalism, the idea of ideological core of nationalism. So what was new to this, what Dr. Liddle has been bringing out from her work, and particularly her last work on the revolt itself, was the fact that new sources always gave a new kind of armament to historians to bring out something new. And what Swapna's book has brought out in recent times is the complexity of that revolt and the kind of nation ideas of nation nationalism, idea of nation that was emerging even then, which the previous generation of historians, including our own teacher, Bipin Chandra and others, did not actually give us, they led us to this path, but did not actually in 1950s or 60s invoke that way, that stronger way, which Swapna could invoke so strongly because she has mastered these new sources. So that, as a historian, I think is an achievement of our historical research in India and in Indian institutions like JNU and Jamia and Delhi universities and Aligarh. The second that one may take from this lecture, and many of the audience who are not familiar with, again, the historical debate, is the kind of lesson back and forth of this revolt. And Swapna brings out so well in the fact that one violence of this nature overturns the society. So every section is the Dilliwalas are against Purvaiyas and Purvaiyas are against Punjabis, and all kind of thing happened during the because the Punjabi soldiers who were brought in, they were remembering the kind of butchering that happened in the Battle of Gujarat and Punjab in just a couple of almost 10 years back. So they were remembering all of these. So the revenge, which became part of this revolt, remained in the social psyche. And all of these got together to create the social upturning that was happening. But the larger, the greater violence, which Gandhiji in 1942, in response to Tottenham, the Home Secretary's allegation that Gandhi was indulging in violence, wrote the leonine violence of the nation, the state, the British colonial state, that we see today when the colonial violence comes in Gaza or anywhere you see Aleppo, anywhere you see the violence, it's a much more bigger violence than what we can even imagine. The elite and poor can imagine themselves fighting against each other. So that is one lesson. So what did this do to the future leadership, the future imagination, particularly political in this sense? I think when Gandhi and others started, or rather national movement, when it just started emerging in the 1860s and 70s, the lesson of the revolt was very much there. That we cannot have violence because this leonine violence of the colonial states is much bigger. So one reaction was, let's collaborate with the colonial, let's modernize ourselves because we cannot match that violence. And many of the leaders have, different community leaders, different other leaders had chosen that path. What national movement, on the other hand, the formation of Congress, Liberal Federation, Calcutta, Bombay, Madras, had actually opted out is to have a different kind of path, which will lead to finally what we had, the largest mass movement in human history, that is Indian national movement. Now, how do we create that mass movement? And that is again the other lesson that this revolt and your lecture has brought out beautifully, is that we have this notion of people different kind, people divided in different kind. And if we remain divided, we cannot have this mass movement or unity of people. Also, this unity is required for a nation to come up, this kind of idea of a nation that Muhammad Bakr was talking about. In that sense, then Hindu-Muslim unity became a core principle for national movement even till today, that Indian nation is a nation of people together rather than disparate communities. And particularly in the national movement, freedom movement, this became a central slogan. Almost every decade you could hear it, and Gandhiji made it a central point of all his launches, constructive programs, all the movements he launched, non-cooperation, civil disobedience, or Quit India movement. The central was Hindu-Muslim unity. Now, the other side, the British colonial state also learned this lesson, that if this unity comes in, as the Purvaiyas have shown, then there's a danger to the state. So all the efforts post 1857 by the colonial state was to break this unity. Now, how do you do that? You do that in the new format of institution that came up, many times by default, but many times, most of the time by design. You keep this separate, this community separate. And as educated elite was emerging, you keep this elite separate from each other through different nodes, different models, representation, give more representation to one against the other, cut this against the other, larger, rather than making the cake bigger, you divide the cake into different pieces so that they can keep fighting with each other. The third idea that colonial state understood, that if the educated elite that was building that came up actually as a fulcrum of this Delhi's revolt needs to be incorporated within the colonial state. Therefore, post 1860s, if you read many of the historians, for example, T.R. Metcalf and others have written about it, how the elite has to be incorporated in the system. And that is where the crowning achievement of freedom movement from 1860s onwards is the Indian intellectual class or intelligentsia's understanding of colonial state much more sharper. That it, when to get incorporated and when to rebel, remains a very wisely debated, discussed, and articulated. And that's why even today, Indian intelligentsia is by far a section which is even fighting against most of the time, even against the Indian state, when it wants to divide, it wants to incorporate on terms which are against the nation. Therefore, the lessons of revolt was not just to, and as Swapna has so brilliantly suggested to all of us, that the nation idea of nation, that Hindu Muslim one. The second is the fact that colonialism is economic expropriation, exploitation, is emerging to come as an intellectual articulation, which began to be articulated in different parts of the city, the country. And it is in this sense that in 2007, I think when 150th anniversary of 1857 was celebrated all across, Indian Council for Historical Research organized hundreds of seminars. And the one lesson that was common from all the region, even small region of Madhya Pradesh or Tamil Nadu, the message that was conveyed was that the British was seen as not us. We are we, they are they. And not on the terms as so affirmatively Swapna talked about. They are not on a xenophobic term, not a British as a foreigner term, but they are not us. We are here. And in fact, this is very iconic statement, because by then Mughals were not just Mughals. Mughal elite was known as Mughal elite. They were not Iranis, they're not Turanis, they're not Rajput, they're not Marathas. They've become kind of Indians. And that is what emerged, that is what needed to be propagated further. And that is where the British succeeded in weaning away sections in order to foment what we in future would call communalism, where the different communities were identified, defined in terms of their religion, rather than this emerging idea of a nation. I think in this sense, Swapna's I would say masterclass has given us all the elements that was part of this. And to end this, I would say that the sources that she quotes quite often are people who are familiar with Urdu literature, Persian literature of that period, or even various regional literature may have access to these, but they don't. The sophistication of historical analysis that Swapna presented this evening may not be available to many of them. I think what we saw together, this evening, was a very sophisticated analysis of these sources that she brought to bear upon, which would shoulder our understanding of Indian nation building, understanding of colonialism, and the idea of violence that society engages with itself, and how society should take precaution too, so that it does not engage itself, allow others to rather bring in as we are seeing across the world. And that was two lessons that we learned from the revolt, that how to unite that new articulation into political movement, Hindu-Muslim unity, and the idea of nation. I think that is a crowning achievement of this lecture. Thank you so much.
Wonderful concluding remarks, no doubt about it, and you articulated very well. Now, before we enter into question and answer session, just the announcement for upcoming Saturday talk. Rafat? Rafat? Yeah. Well, Nehru is back. Nehru is very much back these days. Professor Aditya Mukherjee's latest book, Nehru's India, Past, Present, and Future. He is going to talk coming Saturday, and the introductory remarks will be given by Professor Vinita Damodharan from Sussex, UK. Professor Sebastian Joseph from Kerala will be giving the concluding remarks. This book is much talked about in Delhi and elsewhere these days. Big gatherings and big talks and lectures going around in the all around India. So please join us on coming Saturday on this topic. So over to Dr. Rafat Hussain for question and answer session.
Thank you, Dr. Raziuddin. So question and answer session is open for comments and questions. Let's see. There are two options. One is you can raise your digital hand or put your comment or the question in the chat box. So here, before we begin, I'd like to thank Dr. Liddle and of course, Mr. Safavi and Dr. Batabial. So thank you all, three speakers. It was wonderful. Let's begin with the raised hand. Okay, Tariq Farooqi Saab, and then Dr. Nazir Ahmad, and then Hassan. So Tariq Farooqi, please.
Thank you very much, Rafat, and thank you to the speakers. Excellent presentation. Really was a learning experience for me about what happened in the 1850s, during 1857 revolt and the aftermath of that, the churning of the social order, and why did the revolt fail in Delhi. I think the insight that was presented by Dr. Swapna Liddle was eye-opening, excellent. And in the summary presented by Dr. Rakesh, and the development of us versus them, where us actually included Muslims, and how that was then manipulated by the British Empire to create the schism, the division afterwards, so that they could divide and rule, and that we can still see happening in the present. Thank you very much. It is really not a question, but an appreciation of what was said today. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Dr. Nazir Ahmad, please.
Thank you, Dr. Riddle, and also Dr. Rakesh for your insightful comments and the microcosm of the uprising that we had from a perspective of Delhi. My question relates to whether or not there was any kind of ideology or a transcendent idea of Hindustaniyat, whether it be in Urdu literature or any other literature, any other languages, in the middle of the 19th century. And I asked that question for the following reasons. Number one, it is not quite correct to say that the British replaced the Mughal Empire, because the India of the 18th century was in an advanced stage of implosion. There were the Marathas in western and central India, the Nizam and Tipu Sultan in the south, and later the Sikhs in the Punjab. Fast forward to the middle of the 19th century, the uprising appears from a historical perspective to be a local protest against global centration that was in an advanced state. It was not just in India. The Dutch in Indonesia was there, the French in North Africa, the Tsar was advancing in Central Asia. So the entire world was moving in the direction of economic centration, as was rightly pointed out by Dr. Riddle and Dr. Rakesh, that the issues were economic. So the question is, was there anything besides a description of what was going on, and besides protests, and besides the violence and so on? Was there any idea anywhere in any of the languages of Hindustaniyat? It was not just Hindu Muslim. The Sikhs were a major player in the Punjab. Indeed, the first contingent of soldiers that marched into the Red Fort was a Sikh contingent, not British. In any case, ma'am, if you would please throw some light on it.
Yeah. So you're very right. The Mughal Empire had long disintegrated. There was no Mughal Empire, had not been a Mughal Empire for a long time. But what we do forget is that in the Indian imagination of the common peasant, who was also a part of that peasantry, was also the soldier, for a large number of them, in their minds, the Mughal emperor was the fount of sovereignty, was the fount of authority. And that had a surprisingly long history. I mean, it is so long that when in 1877 Queen Victoria decides to adopt the title of Empress, the announcement is made via a darbar in Delhi. Subsequent coronation darbars happened there. In 1911, the British decide that in order to somehow manage to rescue their empire, they have to come back to Delhi. And it is specifically said that they want to, for the people of India to be able to see the British monarch as a successor, as a legitimate successor to the Mughal emperor. It is so very clear. You have the 1911 Darbar when George V is he's made to stand in the same window in which the Mughal emperor used to stand, the Jharokha-e-Darshan. He's made to stand, and so that he can appear to the people as the Mughal emperor appeared. So much is the power of this idea of Mughal sovereignty that is so long lasting, much beyond 1857 also it happens. So that is one aspect of there. As far as your idea of the Hindustaniyat goes, I must say that my readings are not very wide. I will confess that they are not very wide. But the idea of a nation rather than things which are, even people like Ghalib, of course, had talked about mere hum watan yani Hindi log. So there are cultural formulations of that kind of what Hindustaniyat is. But the idea of the nation is, as you are seeing emerging from 1857 and later, is a much more complex idea. It is not simply based on some cultural commonalities. This can exist beyond and in spite of commonalities. The idea is that there is this wonderful, again, a newspaper article by Mohammad Bakir where he says कि जो इस शहर के रहने वाले हैं, चाहे वो सिख हो, चाहे अफगान हो, चाहे, and he lists one whole list of people, and he said they should all come together because we are one, and we should fight this oppressor. And the idea is that the nation can be made out of infinitely varied groups. They don't need to have anything in common except the fact of this shared identity, not identity, but a shared oppression by the British. It is not for nothing that there were people in our national movement itself, like Pandit Nehru, for instance, recognizes this of the idea of a nation in the making. And our colonial experience has been a part of that, which has helped to all formation of a nation is a historic thing. And our history and the, how our nation develops, definitely the history of the national history of anti-colonial struggle is a very much part of that formation of the nation. So that's the only thing that I'll say. But I will say that I don't have the grasp on all the kind of literature that might exist on that kind of thing.
Thank you, Dr. Liddle. The next is Hassan Saab. I ask you to unmute, please. Hassan Saab, okay, let's move on.
I'm trying to unmute myself. Can I be heard?
Yeah, please go ahead.
If you give me a minute. Yeah, the question that I have, it arises from this book by Morgenstein Fürst, Indian Muslim Minorities and the 1857 Rebellion. And she makes a very interesting point that 1857 marks the process of minoritization of the Muslims in India. Minority not being demographic, but the denial of access to power and privilege by the ruling dispensation to a specifically defined population. I just wanted to get Swapna's perspective on that and whether she has something to say differently or to add to it.
Thank you so much. That's a very important question, and of course, my I stopped short of that aspect because I was looking at 1857 and not what happens beyond. But very, very much a part of that. Yes, I wholeheartedly agree because, and the reason is very simple. According to me, the reason is that 1857 opened the British government's, all the authorities' eyes to one important fact of the Indian situation, which was the kind of power the Mughal emperor still could command. And that really scared them because they thought that he had become totally irrelevant. And it was clearly not so. The Mughal name still had this magnetic power with it. So they decided that they would brand the Revolt of 1857 as a conspiracy of Muslims against British rule, led by an emperor who was a Muslim emperor. The Mughals never identified themselves as Muslim emperors, but the idea is that this is a Muslim ruler who has instigated the Muslims to revolt. And once that formulation is made, and according to me, a very important part of why that formulation is made is to discredit the Mughal emperor and give an excuse for him to be completely finished, to finish the dynasty altogether. But what happens is this identifies Mughals identifies the Muslims as being primarily responsible for the revolt, which is nonsense because, I mean, much of the soldiers who had revolted are not Muslims also. And there is that kind of divide is not there. So the idea that it is Muslims who are primarily responsible, it is Muslims who will be primarily punished, that causes huge problems. And it also, unfortunately, also ends up driving a wedge between Muslims and some of the others. Because in Delhi, one of the things that we see then is because people realize, those who are not Muslim realize that this is one easy way to, this gives them a way out. So there are people who say, it's only Muslims who were doing this. We were not doing this. And you can see that there is a self-preservation going on there, right? But the idea is in order to do that self-preservation, they fall into this this formulation that the British have made, and it's a vicious cycle which develops. And then the British, once this divide has happened because of this kind of circumstance, they find that this is the easy way to divide, and let's carry on with it. And that leads to, definitely, I quite agree, 1857 is a very important moment in that kind of development. And it just keeps getting worse and worse as the national movement progresses. There is also this, because of the way the colonial state responds by promoting this communal feeling.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Liddle. So let's pick up something from the chat box. From Vogan, are archives of such Urdu newspaper articles available anywhere online for reading?
Online, I would say that there is a book that has been published. There are, of course, the unpublished newspapers are held in the National Archives in Delhi. They are there in the Osmania University Library, Sajan Lal collection. They are there in the British Library in London. But selections have also been published. There's an old book called 1857 Akhbar or Dastavezat. So these are this book. The name of the author is escaping me, but 1857. If you go to a website like Rekhta, where you find a lot of books, you will find 1857 Akhbar or Dastavez. I think that's the name of the book. Author, I'm sorry, is missing in my memory.
Another is from Ishani Mukherjee. Do you think there are lessons from history that we can use to prevent the division and fissures we see in today's India?
Well, the question is very simple. The lessons are there to be learned if we open our eyes and are willing to take those lessons. There is a verse in the Bible that I remember. There are none so blind as those who will not see. What can we do about those people who will not see? But
thank you. Okay, Dr. Syed Ahmed from Digital Hand.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Liddle and all the speakers. I'm very impressed. I think your delivery was so smooth, so interesting, captivating. I was trying to get away to pick up a cup of tea, but I couldn't find a place when to do it. Anyway, thank you. What you said about the Mughal dynasty is so pertinent, and I am impressed. The fact that the last emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, he was an old man, feeble, I mean, he had no authority. But when the revolt started in Meerut, Hindu and Muslim, initially Hindu, they all came to Delhi. Symbolically, they didn't go anywhere else. That's where they associated themselves in India. This guy, old guy, symbolized India for them. Even before them, in the days of Shah Alam, Marathas had all the authority, but every edict they issued was in the name of Mughal emperor. All the Mughal emperor were helpless, and they had no authority left. But that was the symbol of unity of India. Having said that, what I wonder is why we failed at that time, people, to ignite some kind of a nationalism. The revolt was confined to North India, and not even entirely North India. The British, they used mostly Indian troops to suppress the revolt then and thereafter. So why is it that there was no ability to ignite a feeling of nationalism, cohesion on that basis? Otherwise, the British was not so many. I mean, a huge country, India, and population, they were able to suppress it and keep away for another 150 years. Thank you.
I think this is something that we as historians do study, and it's very simple. It just goes to prove there is no strong national movement yet. These are spontaneous, spontaneous. It's a spontaneous uprising against many kinds of grievances that are there against colonial rule. The idea of peasants losing their land, rising revenue rates, the racial principles in recruitment into government service, are the army's grievances, the lots of this is also the period when a lot of the small kingdoms, small landowners are being dispossessed because the British are on an annexation spree at this time. You know, Awadh is annexed just before the revolt happens, just a year before the revolt happens. So it is these many grievances that come together. Now, grievances coming together can be seen as a sort of coincidence that happens. A lot of people, simply because the colonial state, because of its policies and how unpopular it is, it has this much opposition to it. But on the other hand, though these people are all united in their hate for the British, not all of them are. Everybody is in a different place. That common national feeling is not there because the nation as we know it today is not really there. The Mughal emperor, yes, there was, particularly in North India and Central India, there had been this strong feeling of the Mughals as the uh, as the fount of all authority, but it is not a strong, it's not modern nation. It's not a modern nation in that sense. So therefore, there are gaps in that, and ultimately we can only take that those final steps once the nation comes together and then emerges against colonialism as a nation. I mean, that's a very it's I know it's a superficial answer, but you can just go from region to region and talk about what exactly happens. The Sikhs, for instance, have a very different reaction. Why are they reacting like this? What Rakesh said, that their experience is very different. They think of their land having been recently conquered by the same Purabiya soldiers. So so they are looking at this from a very different point of view. I mean, why today we are surprised? Why are they joining the British to come and fight against other Indians? They don't see themselves as these as other Indians. That category doesn't exist. They see themselves as uh, uh, inhabitants of a land which has been conquered by these people. For them, the Purabiya soldier is an invader, conqueror.
Thank you, Doctor. Ishani Mukherjee, again, one question. Aurangzeb, a great Mughal emperor, very much identify himself as a very Muslim, didn't he?
Or yes, of course. I mean, in his personal life, he was a Muslim, definitely, but he does not see himself as a Muslim, according to me. And I'm not an expert on that period of history, but according to my superficial knowledge, I would say even Aurangzeb does not see himself as a Muslim ruler. There are all sorts of complicated politics of Aurangzeb's time, but he sees himself as ruling over a land which is diverse. And he uses all sorts of, I mean, these are some truisms that we know, for instance, that the number of Marathas in his Mansab, who had held high Mansab ranks in his period, are higher than any other earlier uh, period in history. He has a lot of course, the Rajputs are also there in his. So he is not, he doesn't see himself as ruling for only Muslims, or the fact that his policies should be dictated by his Muslim identity. It's a complex, these are complex arguments, and as I know that I can't even begin to address them, but that is really, there are a lot of correctives that are needed for a very popular idea that still tends to persist.
Thank you so much. And I don't see any more question or the raised hand. And so I would like to thank you all three speakers again. And I'm just making sure that I didn't miss anything. So this is the last call. If I missed anything, please speak up. Otherwise, I pass over to Dr. Raziuddin, who will always ask a question in the end. And of course, in this topic, certainly. Razi bhai? Where is he? He is having some difficulty.
And that created some kind of division. And probably that weakened the whole tempo or whole energy. So is this like we were always of this mindset?
Razi bhai, we missed your first few sentences. Can you please?
Why?
I don't know. I didn't hear.
So what I'm saying is right now, I'm just trying to make some parallels. Right now, Rahul Gandhi is in Bihar, and he is, these days, he has taken his latest yatra and whatever mission is to show everyone that under this constitution, there is no justice given to more than 50% people, is still in this India. And when I see in 1857, that period, when the commoners enter into Delhi, of course, they create violence and all those. But was that violence the reason for the elite or the upper class, even within Muslims or Hindus? Or they despise these people, the commoners, to come together to become a nation for a larger cause? Is this, and they welcomed British back basically because of this, that these Bhishtis and the Kasaiwalas, or within the Hindu, the lower classes, they are all taking over. And then, Mulvi Bakar or Ghalib or somebody else will feel like they are all equal. Those languages say the same thing after 150 years in Bihar or in UP, exactly the same thing. I just heard this morning 3 professors from JNU or Delhi University who are from Bihar speaking in front of Rahul Gandhi, saying exactly the same thing. We are still seen as subhuman. So how is this nationhood thing?
Sir, all I can say is that the promise of our nationhood that was there, the idea that we can have a different future, we have miserably failed. We have not achieved what we should, what even the early independent India, the kind of the ideals that were there, the idea that we should be moving towards a nation that has greater liberty, greater equity, we have not moved in that direction. And very early, we started failing in those things, I think. We have not been able to overcome. And of course, right now, things look even more bleak as the whole world it takes a turn which is towards greater inequities and not, certainly not towards greater equity at all.
Why did we fail? That's the question. I mean, why did we fail? If we have achieved something, then where is the responsibility on whose shoulder? The leadership of Congress, the Nehru and others, did not they have vision to transform a society or just to rule?
Can I come on this question, Razi sir?
We have plenty
Please.
of time if you want, if you're
Okay.
not tired.
Thank you, Swapna.
It's
Actually, the
much
question
more. Rakesh is ground here.
we are both of us are classmates, so I am also class conscious. so, so in that sense, question raised by Imtiaz Saab earlier about British was a rising power in the 19th century. And it's a capitalism rising, and the full onslaught of that rising capitalism fell on India in the 19th century. Now, there's a very famous article that Professor Irfan Habib wrote in 1960, 63, I think, Inquiry published it, called Possibilities of Capitalist Development in India. Now, what happens in 19th century when the British comes, it actually thwart any Indian experimentation of that capitalism. We might have possibilities, we might not have possibilities, but we could not develop any of those things in whichever light. So we don't know in 19th century and early 20th, we didn't know whether we could have developed as a nation in the same manner as the Europeans had developed, because the British were there. And that's why Gandhi, when 1947 tells the Viceroy that leave us to God or to anarchy, don't partition and leave, because we have lived like that. We can manage our affairs. So that is a kind of dictum. In the similar manner, what is happening today, the full force of capitalism of a kind, new liberalism, whatever you call it, is on India. So it is in this sense that they were opening up different frontiers at the same time. Now, the leadership is fighting, people are fighting, all kind of things are happening. Now, the two biggest forces today are exactly what happened in the late 19th and earlier 20th century. A kind of new economy and a state which wants to divide so that it legitimizes the imposition of the new economy. And that is what we are facing. Communalism on one side in India, which, as you can make out, Rahul Gandhi is fighting. And on the other hand, a new economy, which, as Swapna is saying, increasing the inequalities. Coming from Bihar, I was welcome in the 80s in full throttle welcome, and I'm teaching in JNU now. So I'm not treated ever as subhuman being in Delhi. But today, the coming of the migrants across the world and coming of the migrants in big cities are not welcome. So migration is problem in Hungary, Czech, Slovak, Germany, Austria, even in Delhi. So these are the new contexts. So can we assess this context in terms of failure of leadership, failure of people? I think that will await. At the same time, the new challenges, and the biggest challenge today is communalism. Us and them is so much internalized, imploding the society, that we are not able to address the larger questions of inequality. And that is, as Swapna is mentioning, is a challenge today.
Well, Mike, it's okay, thank you. But I was talking more about class consciousness. The class consciousness, even it was there when there was no capitalism in India. We were a socialist state for the first 50 years, and majority remained very poor, and those majority, unfortunately, were all lower caste. None of the upper caste, even within Muslims upper caste, no one was really left over. The Muslims upper caste also were as empowered, politically maybe not seen so, but I don't remember any of those upper caste Muslims whose families are not empowered, and educationally, economically, relatively less maybe. But how so? Why even Nehru's time, even other times, why most of the poor are always low caste. I mean, when did we not? I mean, did we ever try to change this whole thing? The leadership was all upper caste. Nobody had any idea about the huge masses. Even Mughal, the very Indian Mughals, they had a huge mass of lower caste people whom they didn't, none of them were seen near the Darbar.
No.
Well,
That's why 1857 is such a flash in the pan. It's just, it's a moment where you see this kind of possibility of upturning, but then that fails, and that's, there are very few moments in history where you see this kind of things happening. You do see them in Indian history, but it's not something that is sustained even after independence. It is subsumed under this notion that we are all equal. And it is ultimately just a notion because it does not get realized at all.
sure. Thank you so much. And
Thank you. I'm
it
most
was a good
grateful.
session. It was a very good session. We learned certainly
Yeah,
some new thing. And we are signing off
very,
early, but I think there's not much.
yeah, very well delivered, and thank you both. I think Dr. Rana Sabhi left. I don't know. Thank you, everyone.